Now, tonight we're going to be doing a little bit of discussion on two-house theology, or called the, and maybe it's the Ephraimite error. The reason that I kind of got into that, I was recently in the company of a group of Pentecostal ministers, and I was wearing a kippah and deliberately because I wanted to let these people know of our desire to starting a Messianic congregation and so forth. So anyway, this one fella came up to me and asked if I was Jewish, and he explained right away. He didn't give me much chance to ever say anything. He was just talking a lot. He explained that he had a love for Israel and the Jewish people, and then he went on to say that since he was a believer in Jesus, or Yeshua, he was grafted in, and therefore he was Jewish himself. And so I was just about to disabuse him of that line of thinking when they called us in to start the meeting, and so I didn't get a chance to discuss this with him after the meeting. So after thinking about it for several days, I decided to do a lesson on this the two-house movement and what I believe is their erroneous theology, because what he was saying there, that was because he was grafted in, then he was actually a Jew. This is central to the two-house movement. Now, before we get going too far in it, I did want to show that there, you get on the internet, and it's just a minefield of erroneous information that will can trip you up if you're not alert and test what they are saying. And I think sometimes I feel like I should put out a list of what I feel like are legitimate Torah teachings. And of course, it couldn't be comprehensive, because there's many of them out there that I don't know about, but I just do know that there are some that are really in left field. I will list a few of these websites that I use at the on the notes that I'll send out tonight after the lesson, so that you can anyone can look on there and say, well, these are the ones that I've gotten on board with. I've tested them. I've looked at their theology biblically, and I feel comfortable. And in some cases, I actually know the people that are running the website, so that makes me more comfortable with that. There are two organizations, two main organizations within Messianic Judaism today, that they have leaders and teachers that I feel are legitimate interpreters of Jewish history, customs, language, and theology, and that we use them in our studies of Scripture. And this is, of course, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations and the MJAA. And I think I did get all of the letters right. I do have a little problem with dyslexia once in a while, and I get my letters turned around, but I think I got them this time. So we are members of the MJAA, the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America. So what is this this two-house movement? And it's the central part of the teaching. It's this two-house theology is the central part of the teaching of what is known as the Hebrew roots movement. Now, it gets a little confusing because of the terminology. I've taught about the Jewish roots of our faith, and sometimes you will see Hebrew and Jewish used interchangeably, so it can get really confusing. But in a nutshell, the two-house theology or theory was advanced in 1998 by Batya Wooten in her book, Who is Israel? And the theory centers around the lost tribes of Israel, and teaches that believers in Yeshua, or believers in Jesus, are genetically descendants of the northern tribes of Israel, sometimes called Ephraim. So we'll be looking at some of this is the four, basically the I would say four main parts of what they talk about in House Theology. And since we do have some people on the telephone, I will read these things. Number one, large numbers of modern Christians are descendants of the lost tribes. Number two, due to their supposed ancestry, they are obligated to obey commandments of the Mosaic law. Number three, the Ephraimites and Jews will be reunited in Israel to fight the Philistines. Well, who are the Philistines? Is that the Palestinians? I don't know. They just say the Philistines. And then they have a problem with accepting rabbinical Judaism and some of the things that the rabbis have said over the years, and things that we have come to. In some cases, we follow along with that, and we accept some of the rabbinical things in Judaism. So I wanted to kind of look at what is the lost tribes. What are they? Because you hear. I mean, it's very romantic for people to go. Chasing after who are the lost tribes, and there's been books written, novels, and maybe even some movies and so forth. It's kind of Indiana Jones kind of stuff. But basically, after Solomon dies, you remember that Solomon, the son of David, he was supposedly, he was the wisest guy in the Bible. When he came to power, what did he ask for? He didn't ask for gold, silver, riches, all that kind of stuff. He asked God for wisdom, and so God gave it to him. Well, Solomon did not use his wisdom wisely, and he ended up getting like 1,000 wives and concubines, and of course, all these women came from all over the surrounding area, and they brought with them their household gods, and in some cases Solomon ended up erecting high places and statues and this and that and the other for the gods of his wives. And so God tells Solomon, he says, I'm going to split up the kingdom. But I'm not going to do it during your lifetime out of respect for your father David. So after Solomon dies, then the kingdom is split up into the northern tribes. It's called Israel, and sometimes it's called Ephraim. And then the southern tribes consisted of Judah and Benjamin. So all of the northern tribes were all of the tribes of Israel, with the exception of Judah and Benjamin. And there were still, some of the others. The Levites tended to stay down in Jerusalem, and then there were some others that stayed down there. So, in reality, there was Benjamin, Judah, and probably representatives from all of the other tribes that stayed down in the southern part, because they believed in worship at Jerusalem. And so the northern tribes were led by Jeroboam, who was one of the sons of Solomon, and he set up his headquarters up in the city of Dan in the northern part of Israel. Now, today you can go up there, and in that area of Dan, you can see the foundations of the temple that they set up there. And then also they've got a mock-up of where the altar would have been, and the altar again was a mimic of what was in Jerusalem. And so why he did this, Jeroboam was trying to prevent people from the north going down into the southern kingdom to the 3 feasts each year. You know, remember they have to go to Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot, and so they would 3 times a year the men of Israel, of the tribes of Israel, the Israelites, that would travel down to Jerusalem. And so Jeroboam was trying to prevent this, and so he set up an altar and just an alternative worship site, and tried to get people to say to go up there and worship in the north. And of course, that was heresy, because God had said, I want you to worship where I put my name. And so he did not put his name up there in Dan, even though it's a beautiful area of Israel. It's got flowing streams, and it's the headwaters of the River Jordan, and it's just beautiful. But that's not where God said he wanted people to worship. So then we see the southern kingdom, of course, was with Judah, Benjamin, and some of the others, and it was led by Rehoboam. Now, both of these kings, they just kind of followed after what Solomon did, and they led their people into idolatry, because they would maybe still worship God, but and do sacrifices and so forth. But at the same time, then they would set up high places and groves and different things that they would basically worship the false gods too. So they were like many others that throughout the ancient world, they worshipped a multitude of gods. So God warned the northern kingdom through the prophets that they had to they should not be doing this, and he was going to punish them for this behavior. And the Assyrians kind of made a small skirmish into the northern kingdom, and it was kind of a wake-up call, and so they were warned, and they still didn't do anything about it. They kept on with their idols, and so then the Assyrians came through in 722 BCE and conquered Israel, and took them away into Assyria, and they were forced to intermarry. The story goes anyway. They were forced to intermarry and assimilate into the lands and culture to which they were resettled. But we'll see that there are some extra biblical writings that kind of refute this. Josephus, and there are others that wrote during the 1st century that there were numerous settlements of northern tribes of the Jews beyond the Euphrates, they said, and they were extremely numerous. They said you couldn't even count them. There were so many of them. Now Judah was conquered by Babylon, the Chaldeans, in 586 BCE, and then later we see that the Persians under Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539, and then what I wanted to show you is that he also, in fact, let me look at here it is. Here's a map of where the Assyrians took the Israelites. That you can see in kind of these reddish, pinkish arrows here, that they took the people from the northern area of Israel. They took them in. But then when the Babylonians came in and they took the southern kingdom, well, they took them over into a few more southern areas here. But at the same time, Babylon had already conquered Haran, Nineveh, and over in the area of the Medo-Persians. And so, they already, had taken over that part, and then they brought the people from the south. So basically, what we feel like is that the Israelites, or the northern tribes that were taken off by Assyria, then they had the opportunity then to also be reunited when the Babylonians took the southern kingdoms, because they had conquered all of the same cities, and then they relocated people. So I'll go back to my slide here. I feel like that the tribes, in some cases, were reunited in some of the cities in Babylon. So what I'm getting at is that the tribes were not really lost, as we talk about, as is popularly reported. And here I wrote, Josephus wrote that there's a large population of Israelites beyond the Euphrates. And he wrote that was a contemporary, first century. He was a first century writer. So there's that map. And then we know that before the Assyrian captivity, that's before the northern tribes were carried off, the border between north and south was pretty porous. They didn't have a fence up, and they didn't have a good way of keeping people, keeping them secluded or trapped in their traditional tribal lands. And there again, that's why Jeroboam was trying to set up a kingdom, or a temple, and offerings, and a system of sacrifices up there in Dan, so that the people wouldn't come back. And it was a problem. So anyway, what I'm saying is there that the people from the north were allowed, they would come back down to the south for their worship. And we know that a lot of them kind of stayed down there. So not all of the tribes were taken away and then dispersed to where you'd never know where they were again. And then within a year of Cyrus taking over all of the Assyrian areas and all the Babylonian areas and so forth, he decreed that the Israelites could go home, and including all of those that were up in the Assyrian lands. They were allowed to go, and many of them stayed right where they were. We ended up with the Babylonian Talmud, because Babylon had become one of the great repositories of the Levites, the scribes, the priests, and so they actually set up a pretty good center of learning up there in Babylon. And in some cases, I mean, it's kind of strange how that would work out, but when you have the Babylonian Talmud and you have the Palestinian Talmud, or the Jerusalem Talmud, and they would look at the Babylonian Talmud and the writings from those sages as having precedence over the ones, preeminence over the ones that were developed in Jerusalem, because they felt like that so much was lost in Jerusalem that they really couldn't the center of knowledge was no longer in Jerusalem. It was over there in Babylon. So, but we know that in the New Testament, when James was writing his epistle, now you remember James, his name was Yaakov or Jacob. That was his real name. And there's a lot of speculation as to why, how it came out James. But anyway, Jacob, this is a quote there in James 1:1, Jacob, a slave of God and of the Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, to the 12 tribes in the diaspora, however you say that. And he says, Shalom, but he sent it to the 12 tribes. So in his mind, the 12 tribes were still identifiable, an identifiable entity. People knew who what their tribal affiliation was. So to me, that kind of shoots a lot of holes in the idea of the lost tribes. And then when Cornelius, the centurion, was converted, when he came to faith, they didn't check up on him and say, okay, well, now, Corny, what kind of tribe? Which tribe are you from? Because you're converted, you must have been one of the tribes of Israel, because otherwise you couldn't become a believer in Yeshua. No, they didn't say that. They were just gobsmacked that a pagan could come to faith, and we can talk about that in a little bit more. But what I'm going to do is, I think I've got everybody open mic. So just, I'm going to open it up and see if there's any questions at this point. Anybody else? And okay, I'm looking. If you're looking at me on the camera, I'm looking away because I've got two screens here, and I've got it set up. So, does anyone have any kind of any comments or questions about the 10 tribes, the lost tribes, or any of that we can try to field here? Any questions?
I certainly think you're right on, Steve, what you're saying. I don't have any issues with that. I think that's you're correct in your understanding there. I believe that way. The 12 tribes certainly are not, well, the northern kingdom certainly is not lost. God knows exactly where they are. And but I mean, to use the term, to even use the word lost is ludicrous, personally. And so, but I agree with what you're saying, exactly. Cornelius was not an Ephraimite, if you will. He was a pagan who came to faith.
Yeah, he really was. And when you look at what a miraculous thing it was for Cornelius, because look at it this way, he would, as a centurion, he would have been required to make obeisance to the Roman, to Caesar himself, because Caesar was, he called himself a god. And so certainly Cornelius would have had to bow down before him, and all that kind of stuff. And probably it's, he was, Cornelius was a God-fearer, but many times these guys who were supposed God-fearers still had their household gods from wherever it is that they were from, or where their wife was from, or something. So again, they were equal opportunity worshipers. They didn't look at the one true God as being the only one to worship in many cases, and we don't really know whether Cornelius fell into this or not. But we do know that as a centurion, he would have had to at least go through the motions within the Roman world, as it were, and he would have to, at least play the part. And so, but a lot of these guys, of course, were still pagan, even though they were God-fearers. They called them God-fearers. They were still pagans, and they would eat food that was offered to idols, and so forth. So we don't know where Cornelius was in this in his walk, but we do know that he was a benefactor of the synagogue. He put in lots of money into the synagogue and into the Jewish people, and he was regarded in New Testament writings, and then later on in some of the first and second century writings. He was regarded as a very very righteous man, or at least he was one of the good guys. So it was, but nonetheless, it was still a miracle to see this pagan guy, non-Jewish, Gentile, come to faith, and it just blew the apostles away. And Peter himself, was surprised at it, and he had brought along 6 people with him. And I can. Let me see here. We do have a comment here. It's interesting that Ephraim was Joseph's offspring, and that tribe went north with Israel. Benjamin went south with Judah. Both Joseph and Benjamin were sons of Jacob and Rachel. Why didn't Ephraim go south with Benjamin and Judah? Well, there's a lot to that as to why the different tribes did all of this, and a lot of it was based on taxation. Solomon, even though he was wise, he had a very, very repressive government and a very repressive tax structure, because he was building up all of these the cities and defense mechanism. And if you noted the roads that went through Israel, like at Megiddo, there was a fortress there, and all these places that he had fortresses that to protect the trade routes, that cost a lot of money, and so he was very repressive. And so basically, after he died, Rehoboam rose to power, and Jeroboam came to him and says, "Look, our father was kind of hard on everybody, and now you're in charge. How about let's lower the taxes on people, and so that let's make it easier for everyone." And the elders there in the government thought this was a great idea, and they told Rehoboam this. But Rehoboam had a set of younger advisors, and they doubled down. They said, "No, I mean, if let's go ahead and continue, and even go further and tax them heavier." And so that's kind of what drove the kingdoms. It was an economic civil war, similar to a lot of times when civil wars break out. It's based in economics, and that's what drove this one. But that was the mechanism that drove it, and of course that was just fulfillment of prophecy that God said that he was going to split the things off and go to divide the kingdom, so that it wouldn't be one kingdom any longer. So, go ahead.
Probably the most significant statement on this slide that you have up here now is the fact that Yaakov addressed the letter to the 12 tribes, like you said, the 12 tribes in the diaspora. So, I mean, common sense says, I'm not going to write a letter to people that I don't know where they are. I mean, the purpose of the letter is to get it delivered. Okay, he has a message.
Yeah.
And so he obviously knows where they are, or people know where they are. So they're not lost, like you said. That's the most significant. I mean, that's an eye-opener right there that tells you, hey, he's saying, I'm writing this letter to the 12 tribes in the diaspora. Yeah, they've been dispersed, but I know where they are, and we're going to have couriers taking these letters to the different congregations that are primarily Jewish or Israelites. And then if you read the letter, goodness, it's an extremely Jewish letter.
Oh,
The
absolutely.
contents of it.
It couldn't be any more Jewish than the half brother of Yeshua, the Messiah, and that's who Jacob was, or James, as people know him. So yeah, James is
So he knows where they are.
Yeah, he knows
He's
where
not going to write a letter and then, yes.
Yeah. So
That's
anyway,
great.
so let's go. I want to hit some of the things then that the two house advocates teach, and part of what they do teach is that that all believers in Yeshua must keep the Mosaic covenant, and but then they turn right around and then they reject rabbinic edicts, and then things that are, say, extra biblical. In some cases, the two housers or this Hebrew roots movement, they will reject things that we say. For instance, some of them will reject celebrating Hanukkah because it's not in the Bible, and there's other things that they do, but they emphasize those laws that are primarily Israel identity markers, is what I call them, and that's I coined that one, but it's the Sabbath, and the feasts, the dietary laws, circumcision, and tzitzit. Now, I can, I guess, what I can do is I can kind of revert to real life stories here, and kind of let you know what a few years ago we were on a project over in another state, and I started looking around, and my goodness, I had seen one online, a Messianic congregation online. It looked pretty nice. So it wasn't that far away from where I was working. So we went up there, and as it turned out, it was one of these Hebrew roots movement congregations. And when I'd asked their congregational leader and his wife, they called themselves pastors, and they had her father had actually started this congregation, or had been the senior pastor, and had gotten them away from the I mean, it was an established Pentecostal church, and then he saw that they needed to change and start following the feasts and move to Saturdays and so forth. And he was a strong enough leader that they were able to do that. Well, then he passes away, and the mantle falls down to his son-in-law and daughter. But they call themselves a Hebrew roots movement, or a Hebrew roots congregation, and they follow the teachings of some that are in the Hebrew roots organization. Sort of, like Eddie Chumney and Rico Cortez, Nehemiah Gordon, and some of these others that are out there. don't remember what their take on Michael Rood was, and Monte Judah, and some of the others that were out there. But they did follow some of these things, and it was kind of funny because when I told them that I was from the MJAA or an IMCS congregation, and so basically it was immediately set up as it was me versus them, and so anytime that they would say something, the people then would turn around and look at me to see how I would react to what they were saying. And at first it was kind of interesting to play along with this and to try to talk to them again, I guess, about some of these things. But they used the book of Jasher. And then they followed, this Nehemiah Gordon. Well, he's a Karaite. Well, Karaites don't even acknowledge Yeshua as the Messiah, and yet they followed the part of his teaching where it talks about that the name of God had to be proclaimed, and so they would go out and proclaim the Yod He Vav He into whatever their pronunciation of it was, and they were very, very close to being sacred namers, but it was interesting, some of the contradictions that they had in that. But it was, and they, in their defense, they got a lot of things right. They took care of their congregation extremely well. When anyone had a problem, they took care of the widows and the orphans very, very well. And it was not a wealthy congregation, but they took care of each other, and they did. They did recognize that Yeshua was the Messiah, and so forth. They got a lot. They got more right than they got wrong, but they still taught that any of their men who come to faith should be circumcised, and they had a urologist in the area who. For the measly sum of $500 would go in there and do the deed, and all the men did it, and they had asked me, says, well, don't you have this conversation at your synagogue? And I said, well, no, not really, because I said, the Jews circumcise their boys, and the Gentiles who come to faith are certainly welcome to do that. And but the men who come to faith, I would quote that part where Paul says that whatever state you find yourself, to stay in that state. But they would reject that, and then they went all out on the zit seat, to the point that all the women were wearing zit seat, and all the women wore some kind of a prayer shawl, and in some cases it became more of a fashion statement for them. But they used the book of Jasher to prove some of their points. The book of the epistle of Barnabas, they used a good bit, and especially for their proof text as far as requiring circumcision, regardless of what Acts 15 said. So anyway, after a while, it became obvious to me that my being there was disruptive, and after one of the fellas there was quoting the book of Jasher to countermand what the Bible says, and they were, everybody was kind of shaking their head in agreement, because he said, yeah, but the book of Jasher says that we should do this or whatever. And so I uncharacteristically kind of got a little bit rowdy with that, and said a few things like, that's heresy, and you keep it up, and you might have some problems on Judgment Day. And so anyway, it got to the point where we decided that we needed to move on. But it was an interesting couple of months there that when we were amongst the folks, and it was quite interesting. So anyway, that was my my foray into the two house movement. Ray, you have a question?
Yeah. Do most two house congregations really insist that all believers must keep the Mosaic covenant? I mean, that's a pretty strong word to say must, and if so, for what purpose?
Yeah, this one did, and I think that the two housers do, for the most part, they do that. From what I get.
Not for salvation. Not for salvation.
Not for salvation, no. And I, like I said, they got most things right, and salvation was only through belief in Yeshua.
Right.
Then after that, they required that that everyone should keep the Mosaic covenant, as long as it was the stuff that they think should have been kept, but it wasn't. It was kind of all over the place as to what they kept and what they didn't. So it was.
Here's my take on that. Yeshua said, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments."
Yeah.
In Matthew 5:17 through 19. Those are his words, and everything he said and taught was directly from the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. So, to demonstrate our faith, as this is what gets back to the letter that James Yaakov wrote. The fruit of our faith, the demonstration of our faith, will be our actions, and our action should be one of obedience. So, I mean, I take exception to the fact that they use the word must. I mean, I would say that true believers in Yeshua would want to please God. Yes. By keeping his instructions.
Yeah.
By observing his instructions, plain and simple.
I think that what you'll see written a good bit of the time in the Messianic, in like MJAA, IMCS, and the UMJC, is the idea, instead of the must, it's invitational, that they recommend it, and but it's not one that you have to. So these guys were a little bit more hardcore on that, and then they had what I objected to a lot of in the two house stuff was that these teachers coming along with new revelation. I kept hearing that over and over and over again, that in today's modern world we have fresh revelation that wasn't available to the believers back 2,000 years ago, and you'll hear that same type of stuff from cult leaders, and Michael Rood is one of those, that he says that he has fresh revelation and special knowledge that is not given to everyone. And so when I hear those kinds of things, then I really start to back up and say, well, no, I think we need to look at this. So we need to keep on going here. We're running out. Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say real quickly, I sent you a note here. Good grief, I said Yeshua celebrated Hanukkah.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah.
Why these groups, that's ludicrous.
Yeah. And so I can't remember. Patricia, do you remember? I don't remember. We weren't there. We weren't there during Hanukkah. So I don't remember if they did or not, but some of them do and some of them don't. But anyway, I did want to go ahead and talk about how this ties in with British Israelism, and part of the I don't know if you've ever heard of British Israelism, but the story goes, and I heard this at this congregation there, that the lost tribes actually settled in the Anglo-Saxon areas of the world, meaning Britain and Ireland and Scotland, and that so if your heritage comes from there, more than likely you're part of the lost tribes, and that Western Europe, again, Britain, enjoys God's blessings because they were descendants of His chosen people. And I gotta fix that E there. But that's
Did they actually say more than likely? Did they actually say more than likely? Because if they said that, they're not even sure. So
okay.
The whole thing is.
Yeah. Now listen. The thing about it is this Batya Wooten that she denies, going on with this, denies that Jews have any identifiable DNA traits, that they couldn't really identify anything. But we know through modern genetic testing that it's proven that the Jewish people, Israelites, have definite DNA markers that they can see and they can find them. And that further testing, like we did with mine, I paid more money and to see what happened. And it wasn't that I was asking, okay, am I a part of the tribe of this or that and the other? I just said, we went into further, and they came back to me and said, well, here you're part of this haplogroup. And then I looked it up, and there's a Jewish Levitical website or something. These are like Orthodox Jew guys that study this stuff. They said, if you're part of this haplogroup, and there were only three, they said there are only three haplogroups that are Levitical. And if you're part of that, then you're part of the Levitical ancestry. And so it was kind of funny, because when I would talk to the two house people about DNA testing, they would say, no, we don't do DNA testing because we don't need to, because we know that because we're believers in Yeshua, then we are part of the lost tribes, and therefore we are Israel. But they wouldn't take the test themselves. So I just thought that was kind of revealing. Again, it's anecdotal, but it was kind of fun. And I wanted to kind of look at what Paul's take on this was. And, he used metaphors for what I call the Gentile phenomenon, Gentiles coming to faith. And again, we look at Cornelius. Here he was a God-fearer. He contributed to Israel and to the people and so forth. And yet he probably still had his household gods. A lot of the God-fearers would have had that. They still were part pagan. They were not fully on board with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the thought of don't do other gods. So, but Paul in some of his writings, what he said was that the Gentile believers are actually the children, the spiritual children of Abraham. Now, he never called the Gentiles the children of Jacob or Isaac, and he never called the Gentiles Israel. He recognized that the two separate entities, and we went through that when we were talking in Romans, and where he'd separated those. He recognized that there were two entities, and certainly, if Paul believed that if a person came to faith in Yeshua, that they were really a part of Israel, then he would have said that. The closest that he said was that they become part of the commonwealth of Israel, and we've kind of explained that the people who are part of the Commonwealth of Britain the Americans, for one thing, in the colonies, we were part of the Commonwealth, but we were not British. We were not given the rights of being British. Canadians are part of the Commonwealth. Australia, New Zealand, and some of the others are part of the Commonwealth of Britain, but they are not British citizens per se. And so that's kind of that's the closest that I can come to explaining on that. And so let's see. And Ray, you said you have a comment. Is that to this stuff here that I just brought up?
Yes, I'm going to go out on a limb and agree with Paul on this one. I do, no, I agree with him in everything. But seriously, I think what Shaul was doing here, he was basically historically there was a group of Pharisees who believed that these former Gentiles, in order to be saved, in order to have a place in the world to come, they had to convert to Judaism. So there was a process in place for conversion.
Yes.
And so they would become Jews.
Yes.
And Shaul is saying no. It's not a matter of ethnicity. You who are direct descendants by blood of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you remain that way. And those of you who are ethnically of the nations, if you will, that's who you are. You don't need to become Jewish, if you will, to enter the world to come. You need to come in by faith.
Yeah.
So that's what he was saying here, I believe, in Romans.
Absolutely. And he certainly had the opportunity to say that, and he didn't. In fact, he said just the opposite. So I think Paul was very clear on that. And we look at this two-house. It's supersessionist. Basically, because of their theology, they make no difference between the Jew and the Gentile. That once you come to faith, then okay, Gentile, you are now a Jew. And they say that believing Gentiles are actually genetically Jews, and so therefore being Jewish doesn't really matter because and if that be the case, then Israel as an identity ceases to exist. Now, okay, all right, I summed it up in 4 little bullet points there. What could easily fill a long chapter, but that was basically why I think two-house theology is really, really dangerous, because it's its own subtle form of replacement theology, I guess is what I would say. But anyway, that was my take, and then some concluding thoughts here, and then we'll finish it off. Non-Jews, in many cases, those of us who around who, if we're not Jewish, okay, can we claim any great ancestry or something like that? Jewish or not, I can claim 3 Texas Rangers as my ancestors. But that's not a big deal, and so the non-Jews, they can claim that through Yeshua the Messiah they have eternal life and a relationship with God as well as a relationship with Israel. Now, to me, that is a great understatement. I mean, that is one of those kind of things that, as a non-Jew, because you have faith in Yeshua, now you have a part in eternal life. You have a relationship with the creator of the universe. And then you also have a relationship with what we call his chosen people. That's pretty cool in my estimation. Also, Gentiles coming to faith in Yeshua, that's a fulfillment of prophecy. And there's several of them out there, but Zechariah 8 is one. But the whole idea that the Jews that the Gentiles would want to come and cling to the Jew is that means we're getting close to the end times, and we both, Jews and Gentiles, have a role to play in God's kingdom. And so those are my concluding thoughts on this this idea of the two-house movement.